What's worse than book burning? It's forgetting what literature is even for in the first place. Now, there's a growing concern that universities, institutions of learning, all the education systems have actually begun to forget even what literature is, and that is having a knock-on effect into society and what it produces. Just take a look at some of these quotes. It is unacceptable that a Yale student considering studying English literature might read only white male authors. No matter Shakespeare's prominence in the English language, I find this requirement specifically dedicated to his works to be an antiquated idea. Shakespeare's works contain many problematic undertones. To require all English majors to read Shakespeare, it is to hold on to the racism in Othello, the antisemitism in The Merchant of Venice, the toxic masculinity in Romeo and Juliet, and the misogyny in The Taming of the Shrew. Our kids should interrogate the merit of Shakespeare's plays and the amount of attention his work gets. So those are just a handful of comments which are typical of many of the criticisms levelled at the traditional way of teaching English literature and looking to the classic texts. You may hear them and think something is deeply wrong. Now, what I want to say is the request for more diversity is not what is wrong. In fact, that's a noble goal. What's really wrong is these comments betray a significant, almost catastrophic lack of understanding of what literature is for. And therefore, it's going to have a bad knock-on effect. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a head-on rebuttal to these comments. But instead of me making a rebuttal, we're going to look at the classics, or specifically Shakespeare, to give a riposte to these comments, which will demonstrate how academia may very well have forgotten what literature is actually about. So let me ask you, what makes great literature great? Well, first, it bestows wisdom on the reader who comes to it humbly. It reveals great beauty. It is the best thoughts put in the best words. It's what Leonardo da Vinci called sapere vedere, or knowing how to see, seeing beyond what most people do. Or, to use Shakespeare, he said, to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image. Great literature works as this beautiful mirror which enables us to see ourselves deep inside and the world around us much more clearly, and it ennobles and enlightens. This brings us to the second error that seems to be being made by many modern critics now, and that is that they often talk of literature via the group identity, whereas literature is supremely individual. Great literature starts with a unique mind who has seen something or felt something and understood it in a certain way that they want to convey it across to all other humans who individually have the ability to sense those emotions, irrespective of their demographic. This is why the great writer Ralph Ellison, when he was challenged to just write about the black experience, replied by saying this: I point out that while one can do nothing about choosing one's relatives, one can, as artist, choose one's ancestors. Wright was, in a sense, a relative, Hemingway an ancestor, Eliot, Malraux and Dostoevsky and Faulkner were ancestors. Ellison understood that there is far more, infinitely more, that we share on the inside than any external differences we may have. Literature is from an individual and to an individual. You know, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, both Russian, both living at the same time, both coming from similar states of class in society, neither of them could write what the other wrote. It's a supremely individual thing. And we do great harm to literature by only looking at it in categories of different people, as if the individual doesn't exist. So, with these things in mind, we're now going to go back 400 years and we're going to just let a few lines of Shakespeare answer the critics from the comments we heard earlier. First up, let's consider that challenge where it said it's unacceptable that a university student considering a major in English literature should only read white male authors, and that's for one semester. Now, of course, read from a diverse range. That's never the problem. But let's see what the fault is in that kind of thinking. It's falling into clustering people into groups and not seeing the individual. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare has Juliet say, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Juliet's not supposed to love Romeo because one's a Montague and one's a Capulet. But she says, why should a name make any difference? It's the character of the person. Call him another name and he'd still be as sweet, just as a rose would. Likewise with literature. Going at it based on identity misses the point of literature altogether. It's supremely individual. Take the great classics, erase their names, delete all knowledge of who wrote it, when they wrote it. What would the text be? Wouldn't it still smell as sweet? What's in a name? What's in a gender? What's in an author when it comes to literature? So Shakespeare had already anticipated that 400 years ahead of time. Second, what of the call for students or our kids to interrogate the merit of Shakespeare's plays? It may seem reasonable to some on the face of it, but what's the first prerogative of great literature? It's to bestow wisdom. Now, typically, what is the quality that most young ones or students lack in a given field? Wisdom. So asking for students to interrogate the worth of Shakespeare and whether it should be a part of the curriculum or how much of the curriculum it should be is asking the apprentice to judge the master. It's asking for the essay before learning to write. In fact, it's the total wrong order of things, or the wrong degree of things, as Shakespeare calls it. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Strength should be lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. He's talking about the wrong degree or the wrong order of things, a lack of respect for those who come before, those who are wiser. And he says, if you twist that around, what discord follows? What a mess follows. Strength would be lord of imbecility. That means the strong should lord it over the weak. In other words, be dictatorial, crush the weak. The rude son should strike the father dead instead of having respect for the father. Well, wouldn't that be the same as the student should strike down the teacher's curriculum? It's the wrong degree, and it always leads to discord and confusion. What of the charge of teaching the classics or Shakespeare being antiquated and they're having problematic undertones? This is a really bizarre challenge and is mere rhetoric. Of course it's antiquated to want someone to learn from the best. Since time immemorial, in every trade and discipline, if you want to learn, you go to the best that you possibly can. So for someone to say, I find it an old-fashioned idea that someone wishing to learn English literature should go back and study the greatest writer of English literature, is a very bizarre, nonsensical point of view. But what of it's problematic, the problematic undertones? This reveals a gross naivety. It shows that the critics are confusing the illuminating force with what is being illuminated. They see maggots and blame the sun. Hamlet darkly observed this: "For if the sun breed maggots in a dead dog, being a god-kissing carrion, the sun is a noble force. A dead dog is corrupt matter. When the sun shines on corrupt matter, it breeds maggots. But the sun isn't the cause of maggots." Likewise, Shakespeare isn't the cause of underlying or problematic undertones. Rather, he is the illuminating genius that shines his light on corruption that is around us and will always be around us, and shows us the very source of where these problematic undertones come from, so that we can deal with them. Shakespeare knew life wasn't sanitized. In fact, as he would put it, "The web of our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together." What about the claim that to get our students to continue reading Shakespeare is to hold on to the racism and antisemitism of Othello and the Merchant of Venice? That is the ultimate failure in reading. It's to confound depiction with endorsement. Because you talk about a topic, you must agree with the topic. That is nonsense. And it's hard to believe that some people are saying that as a critique against Shakespeare and the classics. Let's just take Othello. Othello is a Moor. He is black. He is in the state of Venice. And there is the vile and conniving racist Iago who wants to bring Othello down from his position of influence. Does that mean Shakespeare is backing racism? No way. Othello is one of the most noble, upright, brilliant, dignified characters in all of Shakespeare's plays. This play takes place in Venice. That is so significant. At this point in history, the Italian states, particularly Venice and Florence, were considered the height of enlightenment, the height of fashion, the height of nobility, the height of intelligence. The play is set in Venice, and of all the intelligent, dignified, righteous, fashionable people, who is top in its society in the play Othello? Othello, the black Moor. Does that sound like a racist to you? And at the end of the play, we feel so broken at the demise of Othello. But who do we despise? We despise Iago, the white man who brought him down because of race or just because of jealousy. That Shakespeare took someone, and he does this frequently, who in his day would have been classed as the outsider, and made him the greatest of characters in a play, is highlighting the wickedness, the foolishness, the stupidity of people who only see through the eyes of race, like Iago. So actually, to hold on to Othello is not to hold on to racism, it's to hold on to a critique against racism, to call it out for all its stupidity and vileness. But what of the Merchant of Venice? Doesn't that portray anti-Semitism in a big way? It certainly does. In fact, the characters are very anti-Semitic inside The Merchant of Venice. But does depiction mean endorsement? It's a woeful reading of the play. For centuries, so many have said that Shakespeare is sympathetic to Shylock. While he makes this play, he actually makes the Christians look ugly inside it. The poet and writer Heinrich Heine, a German Jew, said that Shakespeare made him a man, a great tragic figure, someone to respect. If Shakespeare was trying to promote anti-Semitism, why did he give Shylock the most immortal words? When he says, "Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die?" If Shakespeare was anti-Semitic and agreed with the persecution of Jews, Would he ever have given Shylock the best words in the whole play? Would he have ever tried to make us sympathetic to him, to the point that people in audiences with tears in their eyes stood up and shouted out, "The man is wronged," and could see that it was the Christians at fault and not Shylock the Jew? To read this and say to teach it is to hold on to anti-Semitism is to not read at all. It is to miss the point of literature. It is to miss the knowing how to see. Shakespeare shone the sun on the dead dog where maggots like anti-Semitism and racism were breeding and highlighted them for what they were. That is something to be studied. I just want us to pause and appreciate what's just happened. We had some criticisms of the classics and Shakespeare read at the beginning. We have just looked at Shakespeare's writing from 400 years ago, where he's already observed these kinds of ideas before. He's already got a riposte to critics who come 400 years later in beautiful, poetic language and so simply expressed. Now, is that not great literature and worthy of study? On the flip side, how impoverished must the critiques be that they've already been spotted and talked about 400 years before? They've come up with nothing new at all. And what we've really learned is that the Academy has become very, very confused, and perhaps with virtuous intent has got itself into trouble. Because wanting to diversify, for instance, and many other things that are said, of course is the right thing to do. But they've forgotten what literature is in the process. And if you look at my last video, which is about using the tools of sociology to study literature and why that makes a mistake, we see why academia is in trouble at the moment. In fact, this idea of a virtuous endeavour becoming a problem is something Shakespeare himself spotted 400 years ago. He said, "For naught so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Nor aught so good, but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied." Good intentions, virtuous ideas, when strained from their fair use, used in the wrong area, they revolt against their original intention, and virtue becomes a vice. It becomes a destructive force. The literary canon through the centuries has stood almost like the culture's oracle in English literature, we're talking. It bestows a wisdom on future generations so that they can gain this wisdom without having to find it out for themselves, giving them a head start. But the critics are so consumed with their narratives at times, they actually behave like King Leontes, who, when confronted with a truth that he doesn't like, says, "There is no truth at all in the oracle. This is mere falsehood." The critics believe their ideas are novel, new and interesting, but Shakespeare knew our time on earth was brief, and we're often blinded by thinking we've found something new when it's been around all the time. In fact, in one of his sonnets he wrote, "Thy pyramids built up with newer might, to me are nothing novel, nothing strange, they are but dressings of a former sight." Our modern critiques are but dressings of a former sight, he says, where the critics think they've come up with something new and profound and wonderful. It's already been seen and talked about before. We've seen that in this video. Shakespeare has already looked at the attitudes that are being mentioned in the comments we had at the beginning of the video. Nothing's new, but look at the difference in the way he handles them, the insight, the verve, the beauty, the technique, compared to, well, what have the critics produced? Can they stand on the same field of battle and cross swords with Shakespeare with the same simplicity, with the same accuracy of statement, with the same amount of perception and brilliance that Shakespeare could express himself in? Then who are they really to start demanding that he be brought down? when they have nothing better to give. It would appear that instead of standing on the shoulders of giants, modern academia seems to be intent on standing on the neck of giants, but unfortunately hasn't got any of the greatness that these former ones had. And that impoverishes anyone who wants to come and understand the many benefits and wisdom and treasures that are in literature. You know, that's kept back from a lot of people because it seems that today we've forgotten what literature is meant to be. The great classics have something no modern work can have. And by the way, I'm not saying there's no good contemporary fiction. There is good stuff, but the academies and the education system seems to have lost its way completely. You see, the classics all have the testimony of age. They have been through the furnaces of centuries, of eras, into the crucible of different generations with different ideas, and yet they've still managed to bestow a truth or shown a beauty that people through all these times have said, yes, I recognize that as truth. And so, while thousands, millions of works have been burnt away through the ages, smelted off as dross, these classics have emerged as the tested and refined gold of human observation of the world and of our deep innermost self. And to take that away from students, to miss that that's what they are, is to lose literature completely, and is worse than burning any books.